Praise the Lord, brothers and sisters, and thank you very much for joining us in this video. We pray you all are well and pray that your week has gone well. It seems like these days pass by very fast. Just thinking, seems like I was here yesterday doing one of these videos for you, but I really thank God for His blessings. I hope you all are doing well. I hope you are managing this time apart very well. I'm personally looking forward to coming back together in a more intimate way instead of communicating through this video. But I always want to reiterate, safety is important. We cannot take this sort of thing lightly, as we have seen throughout the entire world, that this should not be taken lightly. And I think we ought to sometimes just take a moment to settle down, allow God to do His work. You know, my grandmother would do something whenever the thunderstorms would come in the summertime. We would have to, in the cool of the heat of the day, should I say, when everybody is out running around and playing, the thunderstorm would come, and our grandmother would make us sit down in the house, and all the electronics would be turned off, the lights would be off, and we would have to be extremely quiet. And it wasn't so much for a fear of being struck by lightning or even fear of something happening to us, but it was out of respect for what God was doing in that moment, okay? It was the fact that we respected God's intervention in the natural process of the day. And we wanted to allow that time to pass over before we get up and we carry on throughout the day with our normal activities. In fact, we see this sort of behavior with animals. Whenever they see something happening in the environment, they settle down. So I would encourage everyone to take a moment to settle down, okay? Just settle down. Just take a moment to relax and allow God to do what He's doing, and take this moment to draw closer to Him, all right? Now, let's look at the text for today. I'm going to look at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 through verse number 18. And I'll read these verses in the New Living Translation, and I'll invite you to read in your respective translation that you may have in your own person. But it says in verse number 14, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could He die, and only by dying could He break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. That is very important, brothers and sisters. Only in this way could He set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of death, or the fear of dying. Verse 16 says, who also know that the Son did not come to help angels, He came to help the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, it was necessary for Him to be made in every respect like us, His brothers and sisters, so that He could be our merciful and faithful high priest before God. Then He could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of the people. Since He Himself has gone through suffering and testing, He is able to help us when we are being tested. All right, brothers and sisters, this is a very powerful text, as all of the Bible is. And from this text, I want to speak on the topic, the invisible enemy, the invisible enemy. All right. Now, I want to talk about this topic in light of some of the things that we're experiencing. I think it draws a very good correlation. Of course, you can see the relation between what's happening now and the topic that we're discussing. But I want to talk about this because in lieu of the pandemic and the events that are happening around us, obviously what we are experiencing has shaken the entire world by far. In our generation, I don't know that there is any single event that has done to us in our society and our culture what this pandemic has done. In fact, I remember whenever the pandemic became to be considered a national problem, and we were able to kind of discern some of the things that were happening. I remember a lot of the faith leaders were speaking out against it and just wondering what's going on and trying to bring some sort of consolation to those who were being affected by it. And I remember in particular one very well-known pastor in a presentation, if you will, to the masses, he termed the pandemic as the invisible enemy. And I remember when I was listening to his response, it kind of caught my interest because I thought it was a very peculiar way to refer to the coronavirus as an invisible enemy, as something that is very present, but we by far can do nothing about it. We can't put our hands on it. We cannot stop it. We cannot seize it. Okay. And I thought it was very interesting. A couple of days later, I was listening to a response from our president, and he used the same phrase, the invisible enemy. And I said, that's kind of interesting that after hearing this faith leader say this, use this phrase to refer to the coronavirus, I'm now hearing the president refer to it as the invisible enemy. And he kept in continual interviews or addresses, he will refer to it as the invisible enemy. And I just thought that to be so unique. And so as I began to kind of study the phrase, I came to find out that this phrase was actually used 2 years, or should we even say years earlier, by a producer who formed this documentary, Janet Tobias, called The Unseen Enemy. And she was using the phrase to refer to the effects that infectious viruses were having on the general population. Whereas before we have a virus, we would kind of maintain it. She was trying to shed light and draw attention to the fact that these viruses are becoming epidemics, such as influenza and Ebola. They are taking over in ways that were unprecedented. And here we are in 2020 being in many ways affected by not only an epidemic, but a pandemic in the form of an infectious virus. But as I began to consider all of this and then read the Bible in light of what is being said by popular culture, I came to find out, brothers and sisters, that believe it or not, the virus really isn't the invisible enemy. I know that may shock you, but really it isn't the virus that's the problem. And I'm not being insensitive in any way to what's happening in the world. Trust me, I have felt the pains of what this virus is doing to individuals. I myself have become deeply affected by the anxiety and the paranoia of what this virus has done to our society. But again, I would invite you to take a closer look to what's really going on, because I'm saying the virus is not so much the problem as much as what the virus leads us to as the bigger problem. And if we look at the Bible, we'll find that famines and all sorts of things, disasters, all these sorts of things are found within the Bible. But however, they are never deemed to be an invisible enemy. The true invisible enemy of the Bible and of the Christian worldview is not anything that could happen to us, but rather it is what we have to face by what happens to us. That is death. Death itself is the invisible enemy that the Bible is concerned with from the beginning of the narrative to the end of the narrative. So today I want us to consider Jesus in light of the unseen or invisible enemy. And what I want to propose to you today, brothers and sisters, is that Jesus himself, he is the solution before there was ever a problem. All right. And I think we have to talk about Jesus that way, because a lot of times when we talk about Jesus, Jesus is simply the man that came on earth, died for our sins, and got us out of hell. Right. And so our understanding of Jesus is restricted to literally 3.5 years of ministry. Never mind that he was born of a virgin. Never mind that he was born of the Holy Ghost. Never mind that he existed from eternity. Never mind the pieces of the Bible that talks about the eternality of Jesus Christ, who, by the way, came into the world as a man and then left to be seated on the right hand of the Father. Never mind all of that. What really is concerning to many of us as students of the Bible is that he came, did what he needed to do, he disappeared, and then we carried on. And I want to say that if our understanding of Jesus Christ is that, then we have no real grounds for how the death of Jesus Christ glorifies the Father, who had an eternal will from the beginning that not only man could not stop, but essentially death could not stop. I want to say this to you. It was not that man tried to stop the will of God from the beginning. It is that death could stop if it was permitted the will of God from the beginning, unless God had a plan to supersede anything that death could do to mankind. And I know this is a very complicated way of thinking about things, but I want to suggest this to you because if we don't think about God this way and Jesus this way, then we're going to allow all sorts of occasions for why God cannot be the holy and righteous God that he really is. And consequently, as believers, we'll find it very difficult to have hope in hopeless situations. Okay. So we have a theological problem being addressed and then a very practical one as well as it relates to our ability to live as faithful people of God. So when we look at Hebrews chapter 3, verse 14, I see Paul addressing the bigger problem, not the problem of just sin that has been imposed on mankind, but the bigger problem of creation. That is that death stands as an enemy of mankind from the very beginning, even before he falls. Now you may say, well, how is that possible? Well, the possibility is found in this. We are descendants of Adam. In other words, what Adam was is who we are. What he had the chances of becoming is what we had the chances of becoming. Everything that he was and wasn't, it leads back to Adam. But the problem with Adam, even in a great creation, is the fact that Adam was mortal. And anything that is mortal is subject to decay and death. So I want you to imagine what it would have been like to be Adam from the very beginning, even before the fall. Here's a man who was given a commandment that said, the day you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the day you will die. Think about what's happening in his mind. Think about the fear that he is carrying. Think about what it would have been like to be a human being who had everything at their disposal, had everything given to them, but in the back of their mind, they were fearing the possibility of death because they knew deep down they had the chance of disobeying God. And I want you to see how this relates to us as human beings. Brothers and sisters, I want you to think about, even after being saved, how believers often fear death. And this is why I believe this text is so important. Because what this text is showing us is that for us who have the proclivity to walk around fearing the invisible enemy, God had a solution from the very beginning to give you power over that enemy. And it was not Adam. It was not David. It was not Moses. It was not Solomon. It wasn't any of the prophets. It was Jesus Christ. Okay? It was Jesus Christ. It was Jesus who, from the very beginning, was in existence to give us power over something that had not even become a problem yet. And because God had this in his mind from the very beginning, we find that the justice and righteousness of God is confirmed not in anything that we do, but in the fact that Jesus, he from the very beginning had an intention of coming to this earth to release us, not just from death. I want you to take that, not just from death, but from death and the fear of death also. That's why I want you to understand something. As a believer in Jesus Christ, a believer of Jesus Christ, you should not be fearing anything, especially not death. You should have no fear of it because God has given you power over death, even though you might experience it. All right? Don't take my words for it. Let's look at what Paul writes. Because God's children are human beings, all right, made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. Now notice that. Because we are flesh and blood, because we are humans, Jesus, the Son, became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break, get this, the power of the devil, who had the power of what? Death. So the devil had power. His power was through what? Death. Do you get what I'm saying here? Notice how this correlates directly to the creation story, which is why the serpent was able to come up to the woman Eve and trick her into thinking that death was not as bad as it really was. That was the power that he had. He knew that if he could get her to sin, he could get her to die by giving it to Adam, who would have caused us all to die. That's the way it worked, okay? But notice what it says in verse number 15. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives, look at this, not as slaves to death, not as slaves to dying, but as slaves to the fear of dying. That's very important, brothers and sisters, that we have this fear of dying that puts us into slavery, not death itself, which also by the way puts us into bondage, but the very fear of death puts us into bondage. And the only way out of that, brothers and sisters, is through immortality. That is through Jesus Christ. And I want you to think about how powerful that is, okay? I want you to think about how powerful it is that God knew that being born after the nature of Adam was not good enough. So therefore, from the very beginning, he planned a day in which Jesus would come to give us freedom from not only death, but the fear of it, so that we can live in true liberty. That's why it says in verse number 16, Jesus didn't come to help angels. He came to help the descendants of Abraham. It says in verse number 17, therefore it was necessary for him to be made in every respect like us, his brothers and sisters, so that he could be our merciful and faithful high priest before God. In other words, Jesus was a better high priest than Adam could have ever been, than any Levite could have ever been. He was the best high priest because he is the immortal high priest. He is the high priest that has no bondage of mortality, that is death and decay. And therefore, he gives us that same right to not only, brothers and sisters, to get out of death, but to escape the fear of death. Notice what it says. In verse number 17, it continues, then he could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of the people. Verse 18 says, since he himself has gone through suffering and testing, he is able to help us when we are being tested. I want to submit to you today that every test that you're going through in this moment is trying to revive your previous fear of death. And perhaps many of us, we have never gotten over our fear of death. Many Christians are afraid to die. And perhaps that may be your state. But I want to encourage you to understand that death, the enemy death, seeks to try to serve us with decay and corruption in every facet of our life, whether it's finances, whether it is health, whether it is in our mental stability, whether it is in our occupations or our family responsibilities. It is a way of trying to impose its authority in every aspect of living. And what we have as good news through the gospel is that God has defeated all of that in and through Jesus Christ. So you don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to be afraid of being tested, because the truth is the enemy that lurked over creation has been dethroned. He has no more power. He never had a chance at winning because Jesus had an eternal purpose and an eternal existence. And the day he stepped foot into this world is the day the devil began to lose. And I want you to believe that. I want you to see that. But here's the thing. We'll never be able to see that if Jesus is simply a man who came to earth, died on the cross, shot back up to the heavens, and life carried on as normal, as if he never came. If that is our understanding of Jesus Christ, how do we find any hope in hopeless situations? How do we find victory over fear? How do we find victory over death, which can never be stopped with our own power, can never be slowed down, can never really be taken and grabbed by our hands? How do we really find a solution in a problem that we cannot handle with our own hands? The solution is in the fact that God was years ahead of us. He was years ahead of creation. And with its greatest attempt, death still lost. The devil was still cast out, and it's because of Jesus Christ. To me, brothers and sisters, this is where I find my consolation. And for every victim of the coronavirus, or any virus for that matter, or any sickness or any affliction, we should understand that we're not fighting the affliction of the virus or the problem. We're fighting over fear. We're fighting death itself. And I want to encourage you that God is giving you victory over that. And that's why you will win. You know, I'll say this and we'll kind of wrap it up here. I was reading a book by Rabbi Zacharias, and many of you have heard, if you are a follower of his ministry, that he passed away recently. And in the book, he was sharing a story about a prison, one of the largest prisons in the world. And he was saying how these men were in prison. Most of them were there with life sentences, so they were never going to get out. And if they were going to get out, if they were there, most of them, or a lot of them, were sentenced to death. So they were either there for life, or they would be there awaiting the death penalty. And one of the things that he shared in this story was that there was a table there that you could enjoy your last meal before you were to be executed. And on one side, if you were to look, you would see a portrait or a painting of Daniel in the lion's den. And Rabbi asked the warden, what was that there for? And he said, it's there because one of the inmates wanted to relate to those who were preparing to be executed that even in hopeless situations, there is still hope, because God rescued Daniel from the lion's den. And then he asked the question, well, what if they're not rescued? What is the hope then? And then he said there was another painting of Elijah being taken up on the clouds into heaven. And he said, if we don't get rescued, if we can't find our hope out of getting rescued out of the lion's den, we can surely find our hope in the heavens eternally with God. In other words, the painter wanted the inmates to understand that with Jesus Christ, you have hope either way. If it's not found in you being rescued from the death penalty, it is found in you facing death forthright and finding your victory through death by experiencing it and going on into eternity with God in the heavens. Either way, we win. And we have to see how that works out by placing our faith deeply into Jesus Christ and understanding how important it is for him to have done what he did. Because in effect, it was what the Father always intended for him to do. This makes belief in Jesus Christ all the more sensible to me. This helps me understand why I must believe in Jesus Christ. And I hope it helps you understand why you should believe in him too. All right. Well, brothers and sisters, I thank you for your attention. I hope this has all been a blessing to you. I hope you have been blessed by this video, and hope you continue to study and pray and find why Jesus is the solution to the problem that you are facing, and even the problem you don't even know exists. All right. But I hope you are encouraged. Hope you continue to grow in grace and in the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Thank you for watching. And until next time, you have a blessed day.